Harvard Divinity School.
Psychedelic Spirituality and Medicine, February 17th, 2024.
All right, my friends. Hello, everyone. Welcome to panel session 2. We're so excited for you all to be here. I'm sure we'll have more folks trickling in. Welcome to the Psychedelic Spirituality and Medicine panel. If you do not have a program with all abstracts and bios of our presenters, you can find it on the QR code here. This selection of folks here are engaging the clinic in various ways alongside psychedelic spirituality. We have some great sort of through lines and currents, and I am just going to get out of the way and we'll be off to the races. First up, we have Dr. Sharaday Mosurinjohn, who is Associate Professor in the School of Religion at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario.
Hi, it's nice to be here with you all. Thank you for convening this, Paul and Jeffrey and Charles, and thanks for being here. So I took up this invitation I've been thinking about Theodicy in my life, and I thought, okay, here's a container that I can do some thinking about it and talking with people about it. And so here's how I linked that. I was thinking about Theodicy primarily in terms of what is it that we're encountering if we have negative entity encounters, or if we encounter spirits of plants, say, that seem sinister, and these came out of conversations with, just ongoing conversations with friends in this space and in practice and in community together. And I'm working on a project that also has to do with challenging psychedelic experiences, i.e. bad trips. And so I was linking these all together. So I was thinking of it this way, as a way in, that psychedelic medicine grapples with the issue of bad trips within the framework of regulatory systems obsessed with a narrow and, I think, inhumane concept of safety. That is, one that permits the sale and cultural celebration of a class 1 carcinogen, but refuses access to toxicologically harmless psilocybin to dying cancer patients on the grounds that it's too risky for them. That is an anecdote that came from a buddy of mine who's a clinical ethicist who was doing a talk with Theodicy about a very sad case of that happening. And since this framework recognizes only what I thought of as an essentially behaviorist version of distress, so does a person's distress convert into litigious behavior, or behavior that creates financial and legal liabilities for an institution to deal with in order to defend any claims made against it? Psychedelic medicine is generally not incentivized, it's maybe even disincentivized to contend with the inside of that painful experience. What's its phenomenology and what are its metaphysical dimensions? And at best, it tends to rely on admonitions to be careful about set and setting for research trial designers and therapy protocol designers. And there are, of course, many other better frameworks for working with those experiences and making sense of why they happen. And these have been developed in cultural contexts that have long practices with these experiences, certain indigenous communities with traditional use of spirit medicines, non-indigenous grassroots psychedelic communities, certain religious and spiritual communities that have refined practices to elicit, navigate, and integrate special or extraordinary experiences. And still within these are open questions that, that are coming from, for instance, my own just living as a person in community with psychedelic friends. And to the extent that such questions have answers, they need translating into cultural contexts that are the ones that determine access to healthcare for the majority of people. The medical anthropologist Olivia Marcus has written of vegetalismo in the Peruvian Amazon where, quote, disparate ethical configurations lead Westerners to privilege their own onto-ethical concerns over that of the locals, despite the desire to be ontologically inclusive. They accept aspects of vegetalista ethics that overlap with their own and disregard or even reject the parts that they don't ontologically understand or that are not consistent with the familiar medical ethics of their own cultures, which take the form of ethics as sanctioned behaviors as well as ethics as a moral code. Such a scenario, which will occur more frequently as psychedelics globalize and shamanic tourism expands, involves, oh, there was an end quote there, involves various social vectors where modeling of what happens in psychedelic experience occurs. For instance, Westerners carrying stories about plant medicines back to their homeworlds, and then their doctors and therapists modeling according to their worldviews how healing has or has not occurred in them as patients. And bad trips are among the most ontoseismic personal experiences, which are often also ruptures in these stories, experiential models, and worldviews. Whereas psychedelic Western biomedicine may wish to imagine that any psychedelic experience can be made full of love and light, at least in its aftermath, if only the circumstances and interpretation are correct. Some traditions, say maybe of ayahuasca shamanism or mushroom shamanism, may acknowledge spiritual forces that are understood to be dark or even malevolent, or may seem malevolent to Westerners, including spirits or forces of plants, fungi, and other non or other than human beings themselves. And biomedicine is generally not equipped to deal with the question of, well, how does that energetic arise? And how can psychedelic medicine approach the theodicy that such an experience presents? And the more that I walk a green path and a medicine path, the more I feel surprised that anyone actually tries to bother to address these questions through the academy who is engaged in practice and whose center of consciousness is in their heart, whose mode of perception is aesthesis, who entrains the amoral, perhaps, consciousness of the brain to the most powerful electromagnetic oscillator in the body, which is the heart, who recognizes first that we register and then route the broadband of data that flow into us from the world through the heart as feeling. For the academy and people whose linear mode of perception has been formed in large part by it, the, quote, hardest thing for us to do is to give reality to the feelings that flow into us from the outside world as it breaks this conditioned mindset. That's Stephen Buhner, end quote. It's a wonder that anyone doing this work, I keep thinking to myself, agrees to do any part of it in such an institution. And at the same time, the fact that those of us who do so is a testament to the institution's rigid grasp on the terms of valid knowledge and how many of us need to cross altitude from integral consciousness to speak in its cosmophobic terms in order to get things done in the world, like influence policies of various institutions, including healthcare. And this reflection on my ambivalence brings me toward, not away from, the issue of psychedelic medicine grappling with bad trips that I set out just a moment ago. In Stephen Buhner's Secret Teaching of Plants, he quotes James Hillman to say that psychology has stumbled into the heart without a philosophy of its thought. And when I read that, I immediately thought, biomedical psychedelic renaissance has stumbled onto the soul without a philosophy of its thought, which is to say its aesthesis, its mode of perception. To call them cardiodelics might be a useful reorientation via vocabulary irritation, or maybe even better than Delos for manifesting, charis for sharing, cardiocarics. To the extent that medical literature interprets the psyche in psychedelic as mind-revealing rather than as psyche, soul-revealing, and brackets any explicit question of metaphysics, for there is always an implicit metaphysics, it positions the healing to be done as a matter of revealing the patient's mind, and any other beings revealed as the projections of the patient's mind. Yet it uses derivations of the mystical experience questionnaire to measure the peak experience, which are tightly linked, it says, with positive health outcomes. And part of mysticism is that you have to completely receive so that the projective self disappears. And so who do you receive if there's nothing but the self, and that self has disappeared? Biomedicine is silent on this. And in terms of biomedicine, I want to say, some of my best friends are biomedical scientists. I'm talking about how people deal with the question of how we know why psychedelics heal in that context. And I'm talking about those whose way of knowing in lab science alienate them from rather than connect to the beings they're learning about. and whose ways of sharing that knowledge does the same. This is obviously not everyone, but I'll say what I'm saying, which has been said by others and has not been said enough, at least I'm finding, to my students who are really surprised by this perspective, and to many of my colleagues in the psychedelic sciences at my institutions who are surprised by this perspective. And also not just biomedicine. A recent philosopher, or a recent talk by a philosopher for the Mind Institute was arguing for, not for experiencers to develop discernment, but for psychedelic researchers to apply epistemological criteria from without to determine whether the knowledge that the experiencers were claiming was actually truly being acquired in psychedelic experience. And he advocated a metaphysical naturalism, that the mind is an evolved product of biological processes, so doesn't endorse any metaphysical claims. And even bracketing those, doesn't think that, say, mystical experiences furnish the necessary epistemic justifications for justified true belief about metaphysical things, even if we could know what's metaphysically true. Instead, the argument there was that there are always simpler explanations for these experiences, that these are metaphysical hallucinations would be such a simpler explanation in his assessment. And that's justified for him by the fact that these hallucinations can occur independent of an object. They can be explained in terms of the mechanism of stimulation of certain brain regions, but mechanisms, as I will shortly get into, present, they do not explain. Now, even if we follow the individual psychology side of the mysticism that is allowed to remain, the most refined, reliably functional, intersubjectively verified spiritual technologies model for us that the deeper we are capable of apprehending ourselves, the deeper we can take in the other. The plant other, the human other, the spirit other, etc. So we could say that other than human consciousnesses, psyches, beings, are unavoidable to reckon with in psychedelic medicine in proportion to how well it works. And I say it's not good enough to bracket that for after the study or outside the clinical psychology courses, or to pay lip service to it by acknowledging that indigenous cultures have concepts of these things and practices that successfully work with them, which we should respect, but whose self-reported mechanisms of spiritual action are only metaphors, whose ultimate truth is only truly expressed when translated into the physicalist terms of science. It's time for psychedelic science and medicine to recognize that all language is metaphor. In fact, all representation is metaphor. Linguistic descriptions emerge from experience. Metaphors are metaphors for what is to be experienced. In Secret Teachings of Plants, Buhner has, for instance, beautifully demonstrated how the New Age energy metaphor is pointing at the same thing as the scientific electromagnetic metaphor in bioenergetic terms. The particular metaphor is irrelevant. The power is in the meaning. The difference in veridicality is how the model works, how it bears fruit. That is, even a chemical like the indole alkaloid psilocin is a metaphor, a thing that gives meaning a form to travel in. That the form can therefore be irrelevant to the healing points up the futility and ultimately the unhealthfulness of studying and using psychedelic chemicals in more and more isolated ways, like rendering high fructose corn syrup from the corn plant that Dr. Luna showed earlier. So what then is a bad trip if it's not only encounters that psychedelic users have is with the one mind whose existence they can use the Cartesian criterion to validate? How can it deal with the presence of sinister plants, frightening spirits, threatening energies without knowing in detail every spiritual worldview, adjudicating between them and imposing its choice? I've begun imagining a theodicy of predator and prey. And forgive me this terrible pun, but we are preying on plants even as we use them to prey. And we know this destruction is not evil when we ask a plant to use it for medicine, even though we kill part of it and consume it to do so. From the plant's view, if we have not made good relationship with it, perhaps we are a pest. A pest preys on something of value, so we call it a pest. Dang, okay. Yet, as we can easily see when we imagine ourselves as the pest, it has a life of its own, where certain forces are likewise pestilent and healthful to it. A pest and yet not a pest, to quote Masanobu Fukuoka. I'm imagining that the energetically sinister or frightening encounters with psyches other than our own in psychedelic experience can be approached this way, and also in the way we approach a plant's physiological toxicity, not as a moral feature of its character, but rather as information about who can use it and which partnerships will be fruitful. For instance, we attribute no malice to cacao for being toxic to dogs while heart-opening for us. It's a navigation of personal proclivity between different beings to determine the dynamics of approach and avoid according not to some Euclidean moral space, but their purpose together. Buhner speaks of the plants that will, quote, thrust themselves upon you in spite of your desire not to notice them, the weed that will not go away and that you continually notice in irritation, the plant that regularly trips you as you walk through the field. They stir something in your unconscious, breaking through your habituated not noticing. They intrude on you until you begin to take a real look at them. They're the one or two crazy ones that'll freak you out, pick on you through your new sensitivity. No need to be afraid. It'll be a while before you run into them, only when some deep part of you is ready and has cried out for help. And I'm going to skip a wonderful quotation from the occult botanist and my new friend, Daniel Schulke, about hemlock. But to conclude, I'm suggesting that biomedicine need not psychologize negative entity encounters, nor avoid them altogether in order to help people heal. In fact, if it can see this, it can understand how backwards it's been about disease in the first place. Disease is an intelligent entity, though a painful one, and trying to get rid of it without meeting it as another psyche is to try to get rid of the information that it bears, which is the only information needed once taken in and understood to finally, I will caveat, in some or many cases, get rid of it. Thank you.
Here we are. Okay, next up we have Victoria Litman, who is a nonprofit tax lawyer and research or project affiliated researcher with the Project on Psychedelics Law and Regulation at the Petri-Flom Center at Harvard Law School. Please welcome Victoria Litman. You got it. And then this will just.
All right. Can you hear me? Okay, great. My voice is a little quiet, but we'll get through it together. So a little bit about me. Paul just said I'm a nonprofit tax lawyer working mostly with cannabis and psychedelic organizations, including churches. I'm an adjunct law professor. I teach cannabis law and tax law, and I consider myself an interdisciplinary scholar. I have an undergrad and a graduate religion degree, my law degree, an advanced tax law degree. I really love school. And I did a research fellowship during my tax law degree. Maybe I'm a little tall for that. On psychedelic churches and their tax approaches, and that publication will be coming out soon. I've also published on federal cannabis policy, and yeah, what I'm going to talk about today will also get published, which is exciting. And as Paul mentioned, I'm affiliated with POPLAR at Petri-Flom. So my current research, what I'm going to talk about today is the role of spirituality in psychedelic healing and medicine, and really thinking about the debates that are taking place around what that role should be and what ideas around secularism can add to those debates. This spring, I'm also researching the law and policy of psychedelic chaplaincy. So I think these two things go well together. The top is sort of the theoretical. That's what I'm going to give you today. Why should we talk about spirituality in psychedelic medicine? And then what I'll be writing about this spring is what does informed consent look like, and how will spiritual care providers, or how could they really be a part of regulated psychedelic medicine in the state legal frameworks and the FDA framework in the underground. And I'll be presenting that paper at the Petri-Flom annual conference this June. So I'm a lawyer. We love arguing about words. There's a lot of challenges with definition. We don't even know what a psychedelic is, right? But I'm going to give you some terms that I'm going to use, the sense of what I mean when I say them, knowing these could all be their own paper, their own debate. So spirituality and mysticism, I'm going to use them interchangeably to describe this experience that connects us to that what is beyond us, that maybe is indescribable, spiritual, mystical. You can't really use the word to define the word, but I'm meaning that in opposition to religion, right? Religion being this organized, again, a hugely debated word, but this organization, doctrine, and I think religion can occasion mystical or spiritual experiences, but it's not required. Again, psychedelic medicine. So that's the topic of what we're talking about here. And I'm using that interchangeably with supported adult use, which is this state legal framework. Colorado and Oregon is not explicitly a medical program, although it's called the Natural Medicine Health Act in Colorado. And in Oregon, they really did pass it in response to mental health research. But what I'm talking about is a person taking psychedelic medicine under the guidance of another person who is not taking psychedelic medicine. And that's in opposition to communal use, which I think they're talking about in the other room and which I've also written about. The other terms I'm going to use interchangeably, which, let me see if I can move this, are therapist, researcher, facilitator, and guide. So these are, depending on the context, the person, and I get they have different medical training, and I'm really painting a broad brush here, but we're talking about the person who's giving the medicine, not taking the medicine, and guiding someone else through that experience. And that's in opposition to a shaman or a clergy who may take the medicine and who's guiding someone through an explicitly religious experience. And finally, chaplain, doula, spiritual care provider, a unique set of people that all have training on holding space for people during these really intense moments, life, birth, death, extreme illness, that this is a different skill set with different education to hold space for the spiritual experience. Oh, did I mess up my slides? So getting to the point I'm trying to make, what should the role of spirituality be in psychedelic medicine? And I'm cutting right to the chase here. So I'm arguing in my paper that it's ethically and legally necessary to consider the spiritual and religious mindset of the patient and the therapist and the religiosity of the setting in psychedelic medicine. And in this presentation, I'm focusing on the ethics. And in my paper this spring, I'll touch more on the legal. And in practice, I argue that this means including a psychedelic chaplain or other spiritual care provider as much as practicable, or, and I'll get to this later, at least allowing people the opportunity to waive the right to access this type of care, that this should be the presumption that spiritual care is a part of ethical psychedelic medicine. So why? And there's a ton of reasons, but people report that these are mystical experiences, at least in some settings, right? They've historically and are continuing to be used as part of religious practice. There's some research that cited on my last slide that spirituality, separate from psychedelic medicine, plays an important role in improving patient outcomes. Specifically in psychedelic medicine, we know there's increased suggestibility. Michael Pollan in his book, How to Change Your Mind, summarizes the quotes on the screen, that expectations matter. But he's also reflecting tons of other research that talk about openness, suggestibility, how people are thinking about their experience and what's happening in their experience, their mindset, their physical setting. We know that this actually shapes their experience. And to account for that, right, psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy attempts to create a controlled psychedelic container. So do these state legal supported adult use models. The idea is we put people in a specific setting that is controlled. We have someone there that is trained or licensed, that is guiding them through that experience, and we can control that experience. And we know that hopefully we can result in positive experiences. Another reason why I think this spiritual care discussion is necessary is because there's this great article that's cited there, Containment Matters, by a medical anthropologist, Narani. He's arguing about how these containers, these setting that we're creating in psychedelic medicine is leaking, that it's not doing a good job at keeping the mystical out of these so-called secular experiences. Some examples he gives are patients having this conversion experience, something that sounds much more mystical than therapeutic, right? And in Matthew Johnson, in his article, Consciousness, Religion, and Gurus, also notes this, that there's this risk of not only therapists imposing their religious views, but this experience that they're providing is so profound that sometimes therapists may feel like they're a guru, that they're taking on that, or a facilitator, right? They're taking on that way of being, and again, imposing some of their own views. So all reasons why we need to be talking about spiritual care in ethical psychedelic medicine. I think it's interesting to think about what are some of the impacts of these so-called leaks from this container. At best, we're talking about the unintentional imposition of religious and cultural norms and expectations. Narani talks about Buddha in the living room. So he talks about the choice to use Buddha in some of these so-called secular, therapeutic settings. Even he argues that the choice of a living room setting is a choice with consequences. And I think people that understand the broader way that psychedelics have been used historically and even now, doing it inside in the living room is not necessarily people's, first choice, maybe outside, maybe in a ceremonial setting, that's a decision that has consequences. And Colin in his book also talks about the expectations that are set by the mystical experience questionnaire. So if you tell someone, you're gonna have a mystical experience, tell us about it, they will then think that they had a more mystical experience. And I would say that's at best. That's like an unintentional consequence of doing the science. At worst, I mean, we could be talking about indoctrination, brainwashing, abuse. An example, a possible example, although maybe some of you are thinking of examples that you've seen or heard about. There's this blog written by a graduate of Harvard Div called The Religious Science of Johns Hopkins, looking at the clergy study that took place involving clergy that had never taken psychedelics, were put in a situation, they were given psychedelics, they were told they were gonna meet God. And then during the experience, if you read the blog, and I think it's a well-done blog, I'm not here to endorse everything it's saying, but he talks about one of the participants in the study, talked about how there was touch during the study as if they were being anointed. And then after the study, one of the facilitators said, I think that you got, touched by the Spirit of God. So sort of this like validation in this. And no, look, I think if someone wants that experience, is consenting to that experience, is expecting that experience, and can consent before they take the psychedelic, then that might be a religious experience that they want. But the point is, in that situation, it's unclear whether that kind of consent was received. So is this argument that I'm making controversial, right? Is it that controversial to say we should be talking about spirituality and psychedelic medicine? Sort of. So there's some literature that says we should demystify psychedelics, that we need to get to the underlying mechanism of what is the real thing that's happening here, and just forget about this mystical, stuff. And then there's, people that respond to that and say, actually, maybe we should think about what this weirdness can teach us, that this stuff that is non-empirical and maybe uncomfortable for scientists, maybe that is actually worth studying. So when I look at those debates, I think I distill it to this question that is difficult to answer. Are psychedelics spiritual aids with therapeutic side effects, or are they medicines with mystical side effects? And there's this historical religion-medicine divide, or modern religion-medicine divide, but it's not really true historically. And so maybe this question is a modern problem. But the answer for now, I say, is yes, it is both. And so what, okay? The point is, whether you think they're medicines that might have spiritual side effects, or you think that these are spiritual aids that modern medicine might see as therapeutic, we need to account for these religious or spiritual parts of the trip, or the experience, or the therapy. And so Johnson, in that same article, he makes the point that, again, therapists could unintentionally impose their views on participants. And so it's important that instead we operate from some kind of secular framework, right? And as someone who studied religion, some of you may have studied religion, some of you teach religion, secular is a difficult word. It doesn't, people throw it around like it's this thing that exists. But in the study of religion, secularism is not this thing out there that is separate from religion, right? Some of the leading religious scholars talk about this idea that secularism can really only be defined in relation to a specific religion or in a specific context. And that when you're talking about secularism and the definition of religion, what we're really talking about is power, right? So in America, we talk about American secularism, and that is American Christian secularism, right? We have federal holidays like Christmas. I'm a tax lawyer. I work with churches. The IRS, this secular federal government agency, they have a list of factors on how do we decide what's a church, and they call it a church because it's a secular Christian country. And all of the defining things are things that are, based on a Western Christian understanding of religion. And there's scholarship that looks at other contexts. In America, we're talking about Christian secularism. I'm Jewish, so I'll use that as an example. In Israel, they're talking about Jewish secularism, a calendar that operates along the lines of Jewish holidays, kosher food being a more norm. And I would say the holidays are maybe a harmless example, but they're still, I think, an example that gets the point across. So when we think about this idea of secularism and we think about secular psychedelic medicine, is that even possible, right? Like, what would that even look like? And, you know, I guess the question under that is American medicine secular? And I think the gut might be like, of course, it's medicine, it's separate, it's not religion. But questions of when life starts, when life ends, who gets to decide, right? These are religious, spiritual, intense, deep questions, and they're decided by our medical system with the help of the law. And so I think we should be applying the same thinking to psychedelic medicine. And so my work right now in this spring and the paper I'll write for the Petri-Flom conference is how can we protect the agency of patients and consumers, keeping all of that in mind. And I argue we can have informed consent where we actually tell people that you're gonna be highly suggestible, you might have a spiritual experience, you should engage with suitable spiritual care providers, or you should be able to waive your right to spiritual care. You should make decisions about what kind of touch before you're under the influence, what kinds of touch, music, mantras, iconography, physical settings, all of that. So I want to get through these final takeaways because there was a lot of information. As I mentioned, psychedelics have the strong potential to occasion intensely religious, spiritual, divine experiences, especially when you expect it. An experience framed as secular is defined in relation to individual and structural understandings of religion, which are shaped by existing power structures and further exacerbated by suggestibility. I really think patients utilizing psychedelic medicine must be informed of this and given the opportunity to consent. Psychedelic chaplains, other spiritual care providers are necessary not only to help facilitate experiences, but to train therapists and researchers who are providing these experiences during research and otherwise. And finally, spirituality, mystical experience, community, they play an important role in healing. So that research I mentioned about patient outcomes improved by spiritual experience, one of the reasons that the research points to is that people continue to engage with spiritual communities after they've engaged with it during their healing process. And when I talk about churches, I say the same thing. I think that there's a huge potential for sustained long-term healing and integration when we think about community-based integration and long-term engagement with spirituality. And I think that's really the ultimate goal, or should be, of psychedelic medicine, long-term healing. So that's some sites, and that's me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Victoria. What a treat. This is a delight. I'm having a blast. I don't know about you guys, but yeah, I put this panel together, and if no one else is enjoying it, at least I'm having a good time, right? What next? Next is Moana Meadow, who is the, put this away. So many pieces of literature here. I'm going back and forth. The program director for the Psychedelic Facilitation Certificate Program at UC Berkeley Center for the Science of Psychedelics. Please welcome Moana Meadow.
So I'll tell you a little bit about the Berkeley Center for the Science of Psychedelics. My background is in healthcare chaplaincy and psychedelic facilitation. And the Psychedelic Facilitation Certificate Program is a laboratory school. We're approaching the end of our second year, and our classroom is an intimate setting of fewer than 30 students, so smaller group than this, where we begin to answer deep questions like, how can we encourage diverse contributors to join the conversation and take their place at the table? How can we relate to psychedelic medicines and the people and traditions that know them with respect and dignity? How can we use these medicines for their best purposes? How can we receive the gifts they offer with humility and reciprocity? And how can we ensure their safety and availability to people from a variety of cultures and for future generations? So we begin by recruiting and admitting cohorts who look like the communities we wish to better serve. Those who have been historically underserved or even harmed by our current healthcare and spiritual care systems. We cultivate financial support for those who have historically earned less. We commit 1/3 of our enrollment fees to scholarships for those with deep experience in these marginalized communities and provide mentoring to support their success. In selecting our students, we look for people who can enter into a reciprocal learning relationship with us. They will learn from us and we will learn from them, not just in our short time together, but in the years ahead as they become our peers and colleagues in the growing field. When we are engaged in a process of trust and collaboration, I believe these questions can begin to be answered as all of us do our work in service to a global cause of healing. I know we each bring unique wisdom and contributions to that cause. The work of admissions is divided amongst our core team of 5 instructors who interview each promising candidate and carefully curate the final cohort together, balancing the numbers of chaplains, clergy, traditional healers, therapists, doctors, nurses, and social workers. Our careful selection process allows us to tailor the curriculum year by year to the particular people in the room. I never use slides when I teach, but in the first year, some of our instructors did. And in teaching together, observing one another in the classroom, eliciting feedback, one of those instructors gave up his slides completely. This allowed him to sit back, to take in the people in the room and speak from his heart. And this is how we build relationality in our program, by making eye contact, by asking questions and waiting for answers to come, by presenting ourselves as real human beings rather than experts, and getting down on the mat to role play or demonstrate psychedelic sessions with our learners. Another instructor on our team is willing to raise her hand and contradict me while I'm speaking, say that she disagrees, to share her experience as a woman of color or as someone working in harm reduction. Another instructor might bring his perspective as someone working in research or as someone who doesn't particularly identify as spiritual. And we encourage our students to bring their perspectives as well. They benefit deeply from our unique team design, which includes long-term core instructors who each hold a different aspect of the curriculum, who are professionally heterogeneous and also carry a diversity of identities and personal experiences with them. I don't believe there is any single profession or spiritual group or identity that can provide all the answers or even define all the questions related to psychedelic medicines. So we need a wide diversity of professionals, identities, and groups to contribute to a shared understanding of the meaning and purpose of these medicines in our wider human society. I believe our students learn deeply from us because they feel they can trust us. We are clear that we don't have all the answers, and then that there may not be any answers. We're not even sure what all the questions are, but we find our way to those questions together. We are able to pursue this professional depth with our students because they are advanced professionals who are already experts in their own fields. Some are board certified chaplains and chaplain educators. Others are supervising psychiatrists at community clinics. Others are clinical herbalists carrying the tradition of their ancestral lineage. These professionals understand their role in the wider societal movement and exert their influence toward the integration of these medicines in research, community health, and spiritual development. We ask our instructors and our students to speak transparently to their comfort from their personal history and their experience, whatever that context. This includes their professional experience, their spiritual beliefs, their group and communal psychedelic experiences, and their individual psychedelic experiences, whether those are therapeutic in nature, celebratory, religious, legal, or illegal. We are interested in what is true, not only what is deemed correct, appropriate, or legal by any number of authority figures or regulatory bodies. As a federally funded public university, we have to conform to federal laws in all our actions, but we enjoy freedom of speech in our classrooms. And our purpose is the highest level of education For that, we must take into account what is taking place in the outside world, above and below ground, in public as well as in private circles. We are interested in what is ethical, not only in terms defined by licensing or regulatory boards, but also defined by those working toward equity and access and global health and ecological reparations. None of us arise from factual or objective or neutral sources of knowledge. We arrive with our biases, our personal opinions, our cultural influences, our professional limitations, and our secret excesses. Helping one another to identify these reveals the ways that we overlap with and differ from one another. We are able to identify the beliefs we do and do not hold, and those which might be held by another person, group, society, or culture. As a spiritual care provider, I believe these sacred medicines are spiritual gifts, and that the practices that support their best uses are spiritual practices. Psychedelic medicines open people up to mystical states of consciousness and transpersonal experiences that lead them beyond their personal psychology or biology into the realm of spirit. But spiritual beliefs and their corresponding practices cannot be contained by the law. Ethical regulations and protections are important, of course, but governments, rulers, and cultures that forbid spiritual practices only force them underground, where they wait for that unfavorable human season to pass by. The beliefs, knowledge, and rituals travel and transform and spring up wherever they can find a place to flourish, and they are doing that here, in this room, inside each of us today. I believe we have a responsibility as trainers to actually know the people that we are training. What are we signing off on when they graduate from our programs? Do we know what is going on with their families, with their finances? Do we know what their insecurities are, where their temptations will lie? Being a psychedelic facilitator is not a technical process that one can repeat by rote. It is a complex effort drawing on all our human faculties, including our bodies, minds, hearts, our deepest spiritual beliefs, and our support systems. Who will these students call on when something goes wrong in their psychedelic work? Is there enough trust for them to reach out to us? Where and how is that trust being cultivated? Would they take our counsel seriously if we offered it? And would we take theirs? Part of our equation of trust is a formal program evaluation being performed by Professor of Education, Dr. Tina Trujillo. After each of our 7 modules, which together occupy a full academic year, we ask them, no, really, how are we doing? What are our blind spots? What can we improve? We exhaust them with our questions, and then we humble ourselves, take that feedback in, and improve our work as a result. Another part of that equation is the strong community bond between the students themselves. In each in-person module, they meet twice with an instructor in small groups to process what is coming up for them and share. They meet virtually between each module, building that trust and continuity with one another. As part of their practicum, they participate in a holotropic breathwork workshop together, taking turns sitting for one another in breathwork based expanded states. They get to practice also with one another with prescription ketamine, getting to know this readily available clinical option. And they're invited to participate in a Salvia Divinorum ceremony to get to know this master plant and begin to understand the spirit that resides within it. Because we create small, localized cohorts, they are able to get together on the weekends, get to know each other's families, visit one another's homes. Many of our alumni from last year went on to work together in ketamine clinics or on clinical trials. And those first-year alumni have already hosted our next cohort for a community dinner. The intimacy I'm describing here is expensive. It's difficult and it's time-consuming. It's resource intensive because these are the necessary conditions for deeper learning, which is relational and takes place over time as trust is built and safe learning spaces are created. But by next year, we will have educated close to 100 highly impactful, well-trained psychedelic facilitators in service to what they believe is good for these medicines, for our healing, for community access, and for positive forms of transformation and repair in this world. I'm not sure how we will support adequate training models within our current economic landscape, which requires education and training to generate profits rather than understanding these as societal investments in an improved future. In the psychedelic field, there is a powerful temptation to provide guide training virtually. Many training programs have little funding and feel they must train as many guides as possible, as quickly as possible. We are fighting those pressures in our program in spite of funding difficulties because we believe in somatic physical co-regulation. 90% of our class time takes place in person. We believe in looking in people's eyes as we talk. We want to be close enough to their human animal body to track their breathing, their subtle movements, their deep stillness. Have you ever been in a deep psychedelic experience and reached for the hand of your guide? I hope they were there for you in a good way. Perhaps some of you have had experiences where they were not. We need to learn how to be with people in the safety and intimacy of our human forms. I don't believe psychedelic medicines are without risk or without harm. I have witnessed some truly horrible things take place in the psychedelic field, and this is why we need truly excellent psychedelic education. These medicines and the humans that employ them are not so different from all the rest. They can be poison if taken up by the wrong hands or at the wrong time. But I have also witnessed the many wonderful things that are possible. And I believe that in the right hands, at the right time, these medicines hold the capacity for great healing. To support our students through the inevitable ethical dilemmas they will encounter in this work, we are training them in peer consultation groups and will encourage them to continue working within those peer groups for ongoing community support. Can we be honest about how badly this could go and how important education is for those who hold these medicines? Can we consider the apprenticeship models that have surrounded these sacred ways for so long? What kinds of safety measures will truly be adequate for facilitators and for clients? Is that really something that can be imposed from the outside? Or do our ethics and commitments need to be cultivated within, in relationship with others who have cultivated them as well? Can we consider the best possible education to support that cultivation? I look forward to hearing from you all what you believe that is. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Moana. Our final presenter here on the Psychedelic Spirituality and Medicine panel is Dr. Franklin King, who is Director of Training and Education at the Center for Neuroscience of Psychedelics at Massachusetts General Hospital. There he is. Please welcome Dr. King.
Microphones and airplanes and back seats of cars are always a struggle. So I'm Franklin King. I'm a psychiatrist. I work at Mass General Hospital. I have a number of roles. I work clinically. I'm involved in psychedelic research. I'm involved in psychedelic education. Amazing. Thank you so much. First, I just want to thank the conference organizers. It's great to be back here. We were here on April 1st last year. Looks like an expanded audience. I'm loving what's happening around the Boston area with psychedelics. I'm going to lay the groundwork for some ideas. So this is sort of a preamble, this talk that I'm going to give you today. Working in the field of psychedelics and watching it emerge over the last several years has brought both excitement and concerns. And I want to speak to some of the things that I've been observing and pondering that I think the field would do well to consider as psychedelics enter into the contemporary medical system and into the modern Western world more generally. One of the things that I've realized is that psychedelics, in quotation marks, represent very different things to different people. Many of you are probably well aware of some of the highly charged debates concerning psychedelics, particularly medicalized psychedelics, that have taken place across social media, the Twitter sphere, and scholarly and media publications. And it is my belief that part of the reason for the degree of emotional charge that we have seen around psychedelics is not because of psychedelics per se, but of the perceptions and beliefs people have about psychedelics, of what psychedelics symbolically represent to different people. So I will first speak to what has brought these mysterious compounds back into the public eye. First, psychedelics clearly offer an immense promise in the alleviation of psychiatric suffering. I entered medical school in 2009, many years after the wave of psychopharmacology had swept psychiatry, crested and receded. If I'd trained in the late 80s, my perception would probably be much more different and more enthusiastic. However, while the FDA has certainly approved a handful of new drugs, new psychotherapies have been designed and new forms of so-called interventional psychiatry, such as novel forms of transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, have indeed been approved by the FDA or entered into regular clinical practice. I can't think of any major new psychiatric treatment that has debuted during my career as a psychiatrist that would come anywhere close to being called a game changer. Most psychiatrists my age, if not all, would agree with this statement. So first and foremost, it is clear that psychedelics in the form of psychedelic-assisted therapy absolutely represent a potentially profound shift in treatment options for patients suffering from previously intractable psychiatric illnesses, such as anxiety, depression, substance use disorders, and PTSD. But is that the main purpose of psychedelics? Do psychedelics have any single purpose at all? Is that the point? And who is qualified, if anyone, to answer that question? For many people invested in psychedelic research, psychedelics represent something more than just another medical treatment, or so I believe. Clarifying what exactly this often unexpressed and undefined something more is, I would argue would be helpful in defining goals to shape both how these compounds are administered in medical settings, as well as to shape policy on what non-medical uses they may also have. But before turning to potential non-medical applications, I want to speak more about what we are even talking about when we talk about psychedelics as medicine. Much of the debate within the current medical world on psychedelics concerns whether they are mere biological treatments, that is, drugs, that need only be administered with a monitor or in the presence of psychological support, or whether the treatment referred to as psychedelic-assisted therapy or psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy is in fact more than what it sounds like, just drug-assisted therapy, and comprises instead a much deeper reflective and process-based therapy that is respectful to the medicine being administered, to the patient's own subjective experience and their agency, and finally, the interrelational processes between therapist, patient, environment, and the overall social and spiritual milieu in which the therapy occurs. Many of you are probably well familiar at this point with the general model of psychedelic-assisted therapy, which includes preparation, medicine, and integration sessions. And many of you may be familiar with a commentary published last summer in the American Journal of Psychiatry that was authored by the architects of the Compass Pathways company that is pursuing FDA approval of psilocybin with psychological support, as they call it, titled, "Must Psilocybin Always Assist Psychotherapy?" In it, the authors question whether the therapy in psychedelic-assisted therapy can truly be called therapy, and argue that the effects of psychedelics are primarily due to a biological process for which the current model of psychedelic-assisted therapy is inappropriate as currently named and practiced. This paper ignited considerable controversy in the field, leading in January of this year to the publication of an unprecedented 6 letters to the editor, arguing strenuously against this logic. Disclosure, I co-authored one of these. Clearly, strong feelings were aroused. But why the strong feelings? Many of the responses to this piece argued in one way or another that discounting the psychotherapeutic framework would lead at best to ineffective treatments and more dangerously expose patients to potential harms of poorly assisted psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. However, I would argue that the strong feelings elicited here go beyond concern for patient safety and in fact reveal a divide deeper within psychiatry, which reflects a similar and older divide in medicine, science, and within our culture. Psychiatry has never been a field immune from controversy. In his classic historical analysis, Madness and Civilization, Michel Foucault wrote about the ways in which institutional psychiatry acts to transmit and reinforce power roles within society. R.D. Laing, himself a psychiatrist, wrote existentialist critiques of his own profession that at times had been classified as anti-psychiatry. More recently, however, with the rise of biological psychiatry, that is, models of mental illness based on the brain, and an approach to care that increasingly turned away from psychotherapy and increasingly relied on medications, A somewhat different critique has emerged where the field's abrupt biological turn in the 1970s has been criticized for embracing a reductive conception of mental suffering. This in turn has led, so the criticism goes, to an approach to psychiatric practice that favors shorter visits, prescription of medications, and a reduction in focus on critical contextual and relational elements and the overall socio-cultural milieu and environment in which the patient's suffering occurs. Interestingly, you might otherwise define many of these other elements as set and setting. At any rate, this shift is certainly reflected in insurance reimbursement rates, which are substantially lower for psychotherapy than for what we call med management. It is interesting to note how quickly this has all occurred, given the fact that psychotherapy, at least as conventionally conceived, was until the middle of the last century the exclusive purview of psychiatrists, that is, physicians. In fact, the famed psychotherapist Carl Rogers, one of the founders of humanistic psychology, who was not a physician, was accused as recently as the 1950s for practicing medicine without a license because he was offering psychotherapy. Now, it is quite uncommon for psychiatrists to learn, or at least to learn well, how to practice psychotherapy, or at least primarily to do so. Things have indeed changed quite rapidly. I would argue that it is a lament over this change and a desire for a different approach to psychiatric care that is behind much of the enthusiasm and excitement about psychedelics within medicine. While there are certainly many reasons to support a strong psychotherapy lens when conceptualizing safe and effective containers for the therapeutic administration of psychedelics, most people I have encountered who are drawn to psychedelics are drawn to them because of the idea that they represent an opportunity to move away from perceived biological reductionism and toward a more holistic and relational approach to patient care. The psychedelic researcher Tassin Noorani, who we already heard about today, observed in his 2021 paper, Containment Matters, which we heard about today, that psychedelics, quote, inspire a secondary hope that the safe and efficacious containers in emerging paradigms of psychedelic medicine will offer templates for a much more contextually sensitive psychiatry in general. This hope contains a redemptive promise to rectify psychiatry's over-embrace of acontextual drug-based remedies since the mid-20th century neurochemical turn, end quote. So is this what psychedelics represent to many of us working in psychedelic research? Or is it something even more than this? After all, we are here at the Divinity School, right? The critiques of bioreductionism transcend debates within psychiatry and touch upon epistemological divides that have simmered at times to a boil, at least since the rise of modernity, and clearly far before that. George Lukács, one of the founders of Western Marxism, wrote in the 1920s on how science and scientific knowledge reflected and reinforced economic inequities and power structures within society. Theodor Adorno wrote on how Enlightenment philosophy unwittingly produced a disenchanted view of the world and denigrated anything not objectively reducible to numbers as not being real. More recent scholars in the fields of critical race theory, decolonial theory, and epistemic injustice have explored ways in which the existing structures of knowledge and knowledge acquisition perpetuate colonial systems and support a white and Western epistemic hegemony. Concepts such as the cognitive empire, which points to the fact that the global north comprises a mere 25% of the world's population, yet dominates all areas of the acquisition, production, and dissemination of knowledge, are modern-day responses to this same issue. It is impossible to ignore the relevance of these ideas when we consider the fact that psychedelics arose in non-Western frameworks, while the criminalization of their use likewise arose within systems aimed at subjugating these same cultures, whose knowledge is now being used to advance what has been repackaged as a Western medical invention. And what of knowledge itself? Is this something that can be objectified, defined, and learned discursively? What about psychedelic knowledge? One of the first principles of psychedelic-assisted therapy is honoring the person's direct subjective experience. Psychedelics are clearly an experiential process. In contrast to the medical model, which is on the whole objectifying and prescriptive, the role of the therapist in psychedelic-assisted therapy is not to direct or interpret the patient's experience, but to hold space to supportively allow the patient to have their own experience and to engage with their own meaning-making process. Does it matter that there might one day be found a 5-HT2A receptor agonist that produces no psychedelic effects, yet leads to similar therapeutic benefits? Or is this about something more, about engaging with a patient in a process that supports their agency and maintains all the while an epistemic humility. Similar challenges and emotional responses have been seen in the world of mindfulness, which has steadily entered into mental health care over the last 2 decades. Many non-Western practices involving meditation focus on the necessity of direct personal experience and for a personal practice to achieve that. One does not meditate with an agenda. That misses the point. The critiques of the rise of the so-called McMindfulness programs and of the transformation of something meant as a practice for the exploration of consciousness and the ascertainment of bliss into a, quote, intervention, unquote, aimed at reducing scores on depression rating scales, for example, reveals many parallels with what the Canadian author Marianne Apostolides has called the current psychedelic divide. Might the benefits of psychedelics be more readily achieved if they were instead conceptualized not as a treatment, but as an adjunct to a form of practice? We could go further and explore the ways in which there is a dominant cultural bias against non-ordinary states in general. Ours is a culture that strongly values ordinary waking conscious states and pathologizes non-ordinary states, be they drug-induced or not. Psychedelics may seem to be forcing this issue, but the pressure to devalue the experience itself is immense. Despite the fact that a common feature of the psychedelic experience is a noetic quality, that is, the experience of deeply and intuitively felt inner knowledge that is realer than real, the value of the content itself may be more easily discounted than the seeming benefits as measured in the after effects. I have heard of many ketamine clinics where the patient is essentially advised the drug works, but the unfortunate hallucinogenic side effects simply must be endured in order for the treatment to take place. And this is built deeply into our system of thought, including in medicine. We look at the content of other states, such as dreams and delirium, as being at best interesting neurological phenomena, and at worst as the products of brain-based defects. The Scottish philosopher Sarah Ritchie observes that this is due to, quote, an insidious and totalizing physicalism that reduces extraordinary conscious experiences to mere neurological events. That is, nothing of epistemic value, and certainly nothing of, dare I say the word, as a physician and a researcher, metaphysical value. I would argue that all these ideas, which stand in contradiction to existing models of science and medicine, tend to be fairly strongly held in the world of psychedelic research, at least up until the last couple of years. This is not a bad thing, but it is important to also recognize that psychedelics themselves are not necessary. To push for a plurality of voices in the world, to roll back the hegemony of Western epistemologies, to push for a broader conceptualization of psychedelics as a process rather than an object, and to embrace a more sensitive and contextually based form of psychiatric care. It is largely a gravitation toward these things that I think is behind the intensity of the current debates in the emerging field of psychedelic medicine, but it would perhaps be better for the field if these ideas were more explicitly embraced. Noorani also writes of the concept, which he found to be widely espoused among psychedelic researchers, that psychedelics are a Trojan horse to pry open the doors of a formidable and parochial system. Observing the rise of corporate psychedelia, I have realized my own naivety that money and power can make nearly anything happen, including the taming of psychedelics. We often hear of how disruptive psychedelics are, but it is worth considering the fact that perhaps the ideas I have just enumerated are in fact far more disruptive than psychedelics are by themselves. This might also alleviate some of the accusations of psychedelic utopianism that have with some justification been levied at certain aspects of our field. And recognizing these realities might provide guidance toward a broader understanding of how psychedelics might be used and for what purposes in both the worlds of medicine, policy, as well as culture at large. So the next time you're talking about psychedelics or hearing someone else talk about them, ask yourself what is actually being discussed here. You might be interested in what you find. Thank you.
Thank you, Franklin. How often do you get to hear from a psychiatrist cite Lukács and Lang and Foucault and Adorno? I mean, not something I expected today. I would love to turn, we have, let's see, our next panel starts at 2:20. So we have, I don't know, maybe 10, 15 minutes to give a little bit of time in between. I would love to turn it over to questions, anyone in the audience, and I'll also check our Zoom here. Just raise your hand. Yeah, and I'll bring a microphone over.
I have a couple of questions, and in the interest of saving time, perhaps folks might want to answer whichever of them they feel most comfortable with. The first is about kind of advice on pursuing additional learning in the realm of indigenous psychoactive medicines. I think it's particularly while engaging in the building of a professional career in places like here. So like, for example, we can see from this panel's substance, the knowledge base of institutions that confer legitimacy in academic study often does not seem to be quite as rich in indigenous medicinal knowledge and is based in Western epistemological lenses. And even though there is this like really beautiful component of academic rigor and the ability to like apply these things, I'm curious what you would recommend in terms of like, how does one ethically gain this knowledge and do so in a way that allows for kind of continued engagement as an academic in settings like this one. The second question is about autism. I've noticed that it seems to be widespread knowledge among autistic communities that so-called recreational use of psychedelics can provide significant assistance in navigating living in society with less of a mental health burden. And I was just curious if y'all have experience with or knowledge about related research on that topic. So thank you.
Autism and indigenous knowledge. I will leave it to you to decide who among you may be able to address either or both.
I'm happy to say a few things and pass it down. Is that better? Yeah, okay. I'll just say, in my experience, the people who are able to weave indigenous knowledge and practices into their work in what you describe as like a legitimized setting are people that have long-term relationships with those traditions. And I highly recommend, if you have any interest in psychedelic work, to have a long-term relationship with a cultural practice that knows these plants and these medicines and how to work with them. And I don't think there's any reason to have to separate that from the simultaneous kind of learning of Western applied skills around this work. I think they really, in our culture, they need to be in relationship to one another. Otherwise, we're stumbling blindly. And regarding autism, I imagine you're familiar with Alicia Danforth's work. There are actual studies on autism using MDMA, and I'm not sure what's been published on that or if it's still active, but yeah, there's a lot of good documentation.
Is it on? Yeah. On the first question, I think if you can, knowing resources and not knowing your academic or situation, getting like a research grant from a school to go spend time somewhere, you know, in South America, somewhere where you're invited, somewhere where you're adding, you're not just, you know, taking from the community, but engaging with and learning from. And I think I was able to spend time in Peru over a summer doing a learning internship. And one of the biggest takeaways, right, is it's actually not about the psychedelic. It's actually about like a holistic understanding of the world and a relationship with it. And actually was about agriculture and planting and being in relationship with the world. So, you know, broadening your horizons or focus when it comes to learning from indigenous traditions, that it's not like, oh, I'm going to go somewhere and do ayahuasca, but I'm going to go learn from and build relationships with people. And on the second question, I was at Psychedemia at Ohio State a few years ago, and there was some research people were doing at the Cleveland Clinic, I believe, around gut health and autism, which I thought was really interesting, and psychedelics. I know some of the cannabis and autism research has also been related to gut health and the relationship between gut health and autism, and hopefully that's enough to help you find some more interesting information.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, Alicia Danforth's study was published with Charlie Grove at UCLA, and it was for social anxiety and autism. It was, I believe it was like 12 people, so it was a teeny tiny study. they did have good results. It's the only one I've ever heard of that's been done. I think from it's worth, and I alluded to this in the talk, just thinking about, you know, who has the epistemic authority to talk about matters related to psychedelics. And what's going on right now is we're having a transfer of power from a sort of DEA legal criminal way of controlling psychedelics to a medical version of the exact same thing, you know, that still has the potential, highly risky that this will happen, of continuing to shut out all the other voices that really by rights have much more claim to all of this knowledge. So I think, you know, addressing the legal structures around psychedelics is really important, and advocating for legal protection of people who want to use them. I think that's a really important aspect of this, and that gets into issues, you know, between decriminalization and legalization, because legalization just allows capitalists and corporate commodification of psychedelics, whereas decriminalization might not. But really just thinking about the legal structure is baked into controlling psychedelics, into controlling psychedelic knowledge, and concentrating it in the hands of the people that already have power. So it's important to be mindful of that and push against that wherever you can. Thank you.
This might be over answering this well-answered question at this point, but you know, what you were saying put me in mind of you know, when institutions like this try to do something like a mentorship program, and they try to legislate mentorship, like they try to say, okay, you're the mentor and I'm the mentee, and now we're going to have a mentorship relationship. And how does that go? Typically doesn't really go well, because you can't sort of cause people via institutional mechanisms to be friends. And so I've been thinking about, you know, like the question that these institutions then lead us to ask is, what can I do to get this type of accreditation or get this type of experience so that I can do the thing that I want to do to function within the archipelago of said institutions? And so piercing that frame of reference, you know, opening to what is aligned with you authentically in your field of awareness and experience, opening to relationship in that, as opposed to looking for institutional mechanisms to do it.
We'll do one more. And
it's a lot of responsibility. So we have a wealth of knowledge in this room and here today. And my question pertains to, you know, we've seen Colorado and Oregon start to build these structures. Massachusetts has stuff moving through the State House. They have a ballot initiative. More states, you know, are following different routes towards a similar goal. And my question for you all is, as these things progress, what advice do you have to the people, you know, hoping to make this happen? It's really complicated. I think we're all learning lessons as it's going on. We're realizing it's an enormous issue and a huge undertaking that we want to do well. And so I guess I'm asking you for what you've seen, what can be done better, and what's your advice? You have 30 seconds, go.
I'll start. One is, you know, don't expect it to happen so quickly. I feel like people learn that from cannabis. It happens very slowly. Even this rollout in Oregon and Colorado, it's slow, and it's not without legal risk, right? There's no federal guidance memo that's stopping the federal government from cracking down on Oregon, Colorado, any state that passes. This isn't what people want to hear, but like, be careful, you know, go in eyes wide open. Cannabis is not a perfect example, but a lot of people have invested a lot of time and energy in the cannabis industry and lost a lot, right? Because of the federal illegality. And I could talk for a long time about federal issues that remain, but I won't. But just eyes wide open, talk to a lawyer, not to, you know, or reach out to me. I'll tell you some of the issues. Maybe I'll just add is you can make a change though. Go like testify in support of what you want.
I mean, yeah, I think Sharaday, you alluded to this issue earlier of the fact that, we're basically finding our way in medicine to a soul without any sort of framework. And, what's interesting about when, LSD was just discovered in Germany, it was the very first time a psychedelic just sort of exploded into any sort of cultural reservoir with zero framework whatsoever. And, the psychedelic assisted therapy model is an attempt, I think, at creating some degree of a framework, but it's a constructed framework that just sort of syncretically arose in the 60s and 70s and is continuing on now. But for the most part, I don't think that, most of, American culture at least has any sort of framework to incorporate psychedelics. There's none at all. And so that definitely means that there are risks to just sort of, an explosive entry of psychedelics into culture. And I think, the other aspect of that is balancing, human rights to freedom, to practice and to do what they want if it's not harming other people, to explore their own consciousness, to access forms of healing, to access their traditions. So, certainly, I mean, if psychedelics just, blew up the DEA, I think there would certainly be a large spike in, emergency room visits. I work in the emergency room at MGH. We definitely see more people coming in psychotic and manic because of taking psychedelics. It's like a very obvious change in the last few years. I don't personally think, but it's more of a political viewpoint, I don't think that that justifies the existing legal structures, but I do think it's worth trying to not be a gatekeeper, but at the same time figuring out how can we rapidly make this safe for people. I know it's a really complicated question.
I just add one thing, which is I would say also fight for decriminalization, right? And not just of psychedelics, but all drugs, because money interests that can profit off these psychedelics are going to invest in lobbying efforts to try and pass some of this legislation. But that will not mean that people get out of prison or will stop being arrested. And harm reduction, right, will hopefully like being able to talk about, being able to provide resources for people that are using drugs. But I'm sure we'll hear way more about that from Dr. Hart later.
That is the hope. And with that, okay, let us adjourn our psychedelic spirituality and medicine. And yeah, one last thank you to our panelists.
Sponsor, Center for the Study of World Religions.
Copyright 2024, the President and Fellows of Harvard College.